Everyone knows that one couple. You know the one I'm talking about. The ones who look perfect on the surface. Matching outfits, romantic dinners, trips to exotic places, always laughing together in photos. Everyone wants what they have. Everyone envies them. But what happens when you discover that the fairy tale you've been watching isn't real? What happens when you find out that the love story you believed in was actually a calculated game? This is the story of how one woman discovered her husband's deepest secret, and what she did next changed absolutely everything. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you what happened to me, not because I'm proud of what I did, but because you need to understand how far someone will go when they've been broken by the person they trusted most. I met David in 2015 at a business conference. I was there as the vice president of my family's import-export company. We had money, yes, but more importantly, we had stability and reputation. He approached me at the cocktail reception with the most charming smile you've ever seen. He told me later that he had noticed me across the room and couldn't resist coming to talk to me. It felt magical. He was handsome, funny, and he seemed genuinely interested in who I was as a person, not my money, not my family name. Or at least, that's what I believed. For 3 years, we dated long distance because he said he wanted to focus on his startup. He was building something meaningful, he told me. He didn't want to rely on my family's wealth. He wanted to prove himself. I admired that. I respected that. I loved him for that. So when he finally proposed in 2018 with a diamond ring that he said he'd been saving for, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I'd found my person, the one who loved me for me, not for what I could provide. But I was about to learn the most painful lesson of my life. Sometimes the people closest to us are the best liars. The first year of marriage was beautiful. We bought a house together. Well, I bought it with money from my trust fund, but we both lived there. We decorated it together, hosted dinner parties, took vacations. From the outside, we were a power couple. But slowly, almost invisibly, things started to feel different. David became more interested in my family's business. Suddenly, he wanted to know everything about our operations, our clients, our financial projections. At first, I thought it was just curiosity. He'd ask me casual questions over dinner. So how much do you make from that European contract? Or what's the total value of your real estate portfolio? I answered openly. We were married. We were supposed to share everything, right? I had nothing to hide. But then his behavior shifted in smaller ways too. He started making comments about my appearance. Nothing cruel, just observations. "You're getting a little soft around the edges," he'd say with a laugh, or "that dress doesn't really flatter you anymore." I found myself dressing differently, eating less, working out more. I wanted to be the woman he fell in love with. I also started noticing that he was always on his phone, late-night messages, quick conversations where he'd lower his voice or move to another room. When I asked him about it, he'd say it was just work. He'd started consulting for a tech company, he explained. Nothing serious, just some side income. But then I found something. We were packing for a vacation. His idea, he'd chosen everything, made all the arrangements, and I was gathering his things when I noticed his laptop was left open. An email notification flashed across the screen. It was from someone named Jennifer. The subject line made my heart stop. "Still on for this weekend? I can't wait to see you." I didn't read the full email. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. I scrolled back through their messages. They weren't romantic, which somehow made it worse. They were transactional, clinical. "Has she mentioned the property value?" one message asked. "Not yet, but she's trusting me more," his response came back. I closed the laptop and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and I sat on the floor. My mind was spinning. What did those messages mean? Who was Jennifer? And why did it sound like David and this woman were planning something? I spent the entire vacation in a state of panic, but I forced myself to act normal. I smiled when we went to dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I held his hand. But inside, I was falling apart. When we got home, I did something I'm not proud of. I hacked into his email account. Yes, I know that's illegal. Yes, I know it's a violation of his privacy, but I needed to understand what was happening. And what I found destroyed me. David had created an entire fake identity. There was another email account, one I knew nothing about, where he was corresponding with multiple women, not just Jennifer. There were others. Sarah, which ironically was also my name, Michelle, Amanda, and in each conversation, the pattern was identical. He would target wealthy women, he would romance them, he would gain their trust over months or even years, and then he would extract information about their finances, their properties, their business interests, and all of this information was being compiled and shared with Jennifer and a network of other people who were clearly running some kind of scheme. But there was more. I found spreadsheets, literal spreadsheets where women's names were listed along with their net worth, the timeline he estimated for conversion, which I understood to mean marriage, and the amount of money or assets he expected to gain from each one. My name was at the top of the list. Next to my name, he had written, primary target, family wealth estimated at $50 million, estate control possible within 5 years. Marriage equals access. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This man I had shared my bed with, this man I had told my deepest secrets to, this man I had promised to love for the rest of my life. He had married me as a business transaction. I found more files, photos of properties my family owned, details about our company clients, lists of our employees, everything a person would need to take over or exploit a business. He had been systematically collecting information, building a profile of how to access and control my family's wealth. And what broke me most of all? I found the files where he'd been messaging Jennifer about me. She's incredibly naive, he wrote. She believes everything I tell her. Getting her to sign over the house was easy. Next step, convince her to add me to the business accounts. I remember sinking down in front of that computer, and I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to scream or cry or leave immediately. Instead, I was going to outplay him at his own game. Here's what I did. I closed his email account. I changed the password so he couldn't access it. Then I opened a new account, pretending to be Jennifer, and started communicating with him. I told him I had acquired a new target and needed him to help with the strategy. His ego was so inflated that he actually believed it. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator, the best one money could buy. Within 2 weeks, we had documented everything, every scheme, every woman he'd targeted, every fake identity he'd created. The investigator even uncovered the criminal network he was working with. They weren't just scamming women. They were running a larger fraud operation that involved identity theft and financial crimes. I also did something else that was crucial. I contacted every woman he'd targeted, not just the ones in his active files, but the ones from the past, too. 3 of them agreed to come forward. They had all lost significant amounts of money to his schemes. One woman had almost sold her family home based on his manipulation. But I didn't go to the police yet, not immediately. Instead, I started making moves of my own. I contacted our family's lawyers, and I began the process of removing David from any accounts or properties he had access to. I documented every cent he'd ever spent on himself using my money. I gathered receipts for the romantic trips he'd taken with other women while claiming to be at business conferences. I also made an appointment with a therapist, not because I needed help, though I definitely did, but because I needed a documented record of the emotional abuse and manipulation I'd experienced. This would be important later. Then came the hardest part. I had to keep living with him every single day, every meal we shared, every night he came to bed. I had to pretend I didn't know. I had to pretend I still trusted him.
but I was documenting everything. Every lie he told me, every manipulative comment, every time he pushed me to do something financially foolish, like the time he suggested we invest in a business opportunity with Jennifer, which was obviously another scam. By month 2 of my countergame, I had enough evidence to bury him completely, and that's when I made the final move. I called a family meeting.
I told my parents and my older brother that I needed to discuss something important about David. I showed them everything: the emails, the spreadsheets, the investigator's report, the statements from other women he'd victimized. My mother actually fainted. My father's face turned red with a kind of rage I'd never seen before. My brother immediately started making calls to lawyers, to law enforcement, to financial crimes units. But I asked them to wait. I had one more thing I needed to do. That evening, I sat David down in our living room, and I told him exactly what I knew. I watched his face go from confusion to shock to denial to pure, unadulterated panic. He tried everything. He cried. He said he'd made mistakes, but he loved me. He promised he'd change. He got angry and told me I was paranoid and delusional. He tried to gaslight me, to make me doubt what I'd discovered. But I didn't flinch. I handed him a folder. Inside was a copy of everything, and I told him that unless he signed the papers my lawyers had prepared, I would be pressing charges, plural: fraud, identity theft, emotional manipulation, financial exploitation. The papers required him to sign over everything he'd gained through our marriage: the house we'd bought, the cars he'd driven, every piece of jewelry, every penny. And they included a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from ever discussing our marriage publicly or contacting me again. He had 1 hour to decide. He signed. He didn't even read them completely before signing. The next day, he was gone. My family hired security to ensure he left the state, and I filed a formal complaint with law enforcement, providing them with all the information about the criminal network he was involved with. But this is where the story gets interesting, because taking back what he'd stolen from me wasn't the end of my revenge. It was just the beginning. 6 months after David signed those papers, the FBI knocked on his door. They arrested him on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The private investigator's evidence, combined with the testimony of 4 other women, created an airtight case. During his trial, everything came out. The court heard about the systematic way he targeted vulnerable women, the way he'd studied psychology and manipulation tactics specifically to exploit people, the way he'd created multiple false personas to run different schemes simultaneously. He was convicted on 8 counts. He received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. But what made me feel the most vindicated wasn't just his conviction. It was what happened afterward. Other women came forward, women he'd targeted before me. The network he was involved with started to unravel. 7 other people were arrested as a result of the investigation that started with me. I also discovered that Jennifer, the woman he'd been communicating with, wasn't even real. She was a persona he'd created himself to test his manipulation tactics. This man was so deeply entrenched in deception that he couldn't even distinguish between his fake identities and reality anymore. The most poetic justice came when I learned that his cellmate in prison was a former financial crimes investigator. Apparently, they spent a lot of time together. I like to imagine what those conversations must have been like. But here's what surprised me most. Taking everything from David didn't actually make me feel better. I thought it would. I thought I'd feel satisfied, victorious. Instead, I felt empty. I had won the game. I'd played him better than he'd played me. I had exposed his crimes and seen him face real consequences. But the person I really needed to forgive was myself, for not seeing the signs earlier, for being naive, for trusting someone so completely that I ignored the red flags.
So I donated the money he'd stolen back to a victims fund that helped other people recover from financial crimes. I used some of it to fund awareness programs about manipulation and emotional abuse, and I went to therapy, real therapy, not the kind I was documenting for legal purposes, to actually heal.
People often ask me if I regret anything about how I handled this situation. Do I regret hacking into his email? Yes. Do I regret deceiving him back, even though he deserved it? Sometimes. Do I regret that he's in prison? No. He earned that through his own choices. But here's what I've learned, and what I want you to understand. Revenge might feel justified in the moment. It might feel necessary. It might feel like the only way to restore balance to a situation that's been fundamentally unfair. And sometimes, yes, confronting someone and holding them accountable is necessary. Justice has a role to play. But true healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from recognizing that what happened to you says nothing about your worth. David's crimes weren't my fault. His deception wasn't a reflection of my intelligence or my judgment. He was a skilled manipulator who targeted me because he was good at what he did. That doesn't make me weak. It makes him a predator. The women he targeted, myself included, were targeted because we were kind, because we were trusting, because we saw the best in people. And in a just world, those qualities shouldn't make us vulnerable. They should be protected. So my real revenge wasn't taking his money or his freedom. My real revenge was refusing to let his actions define me. It was healing from the trauma. It was rebuilding my capacity to trust, not blindly, but wisely. It was learning to listen to that small voice inside that was trying to warn me, even when I didn't want to hear it. If you're watching this and you've been betrayed like I was, I want you to know you are not alone, and you are not responsible for someone else's moral bankruptcy. The strongest thing you can do isn't to hurt them the way they hurt you. It's to move forward, to heal, to build a life so full of meaning and joy that their betrayal becomes just a chapter in your story, not the entire book. David Mercer is serving 12 years in federal prison, but I'm living my life, free, and that's the real victory. This is the story of how I took everything from him, but more importantly, it's the story of how I gave everything back to myself.